Dr. Martha Desmond, thanks for joining me again. Just as a refresher, can you remind us what happened earlier this year, the avian mortality event that we saw?
Well, we saw it was an event in early September. It was the 8th, and the bulk of it was September 8th through 10th, where across the state we have reports of large numbers of mortalities of migrant birds passing through the state. Birds that were showing up dead on the ground, birds that were just on the ground in poor condition and disoriented, birds that were exhibiting some very odd types of behaviors. And so across the state, we collected, I'm gonna guess, probably 1,000 carcasses of birds from this event, but basically just in a short period of time, an unusually large number of mortalities.
And so there's some new analysis out. What do we know about what happened?
Well, what we know so far, and we still don't know the whole story, but not that surprising, some of what we suspected, and it seems that for the vast majority of these birds, or almost all these birds examined, were in very poor health, and they were in poor health when they entered New Mexico. So these birds were starving, and they were in various stages of starving, and that strong weather event that came into the state intensified that situation, and that's what really resulted in some of these birds dying. Probably many of these birds may have been were on their path to dying anyway, but yeah.
So there were lots of different species, and I'm guessing they would have been coming from different places, but where were they not finding food? What would have, where did this start?
Yeah, that's really hard. And so we don't know what precipitated this. And so it could, we've been in a fairly significant drought situation in the Southwest. And so for these species, we had both insectivores and granivores. And so these drought conditions will affect seed production for those birds that depend on seed. It also obviously affects insect production for the birds that are insectivores. And the majority of them, I'm going to say probably 70% of the birds were insectivores across the state. And with a little down in the south, we had a higher percentage of granivores as well. But anyway, the majority of them were insectivores. We don't know. It could be that some of these birds started migration before they were ready to migrate. It could be that the fires in the west caused them to leave early. It may have changed their migratory pathway. And so one of the things we saw were some, like here in Las Cruces, we saw a large number of western wood pewees. And these are birds that fly over our area, but that species in particular isn't a common species to see on the ground here in southern New Mexico. But for whatever conditions contributed, that bird was one of our most common migrants when this event happened. And there were a large number of mortalities for that species.
So is this something that we're worried, or scientists are worried, could happen next year or the year after?
Absolutely. And so one of the things we want to be able to do is to start to look at what are the conditions that led to this and be able to predict these in the future. Certainly it's not something we can prevent, but we can kind of predict when they are going to occur, and maybe also think about what species are most vulnerable to these types of events, so that there may be some actions that we can take to on breeding grounds or wintering grounds for those particular species.
So we have requested the lab reports from the New Mexico Department of Game and Fish. We haven't been able to see those reports yet. We're hoping to find out a little bit more about sort of what happened and what to be looking for. Have you seen those reports as well?
I have, but just very briefly. I just got them, and today, I just haven't had time to really sit down and look them over. I've looked at at the first page of some of them, but basically what it looks like from the set of birds that were sent to that lab is that starvation was the major cause, and that it wasn't. And these birds were wasting their flight muscles. They were using up whatever energy they had stored in their body to survive. And so this was not a short-term starvation. This was a longer-term starvation. And as the report said, that So department biologists know that migrating birds entered New Mexico in poor body condition, and some birds were already succumbing to starvation. The unusual winter storm exacerbated conditions, likely causing birds to become disoriented and fly into objects and buildings. So what happens when sometimes birds, when they're migrating and you have cloudy conditions and stormy conditions, they're flying a lot of times at lower altitudes than they normally fly, and they get attracted to lights, and they'll start circling around those lights, and then they'll fly into buildings. And that's something that does commonly occur during migration, and especially during poor weather, and probably these birds that are in poor body condition are more susceptible to that.
I was wondering, because for the birds that did survive, presumably not all of them died when they were trying to migrate. For those that did survive, does that put them at higher risk for mortality throughout the year or poor breeding for the spring?
Sure. Well, you know, if they're in poor body condition, and we did look at some of the live birds as they were moving through and assess their body condition, and they weren't, you know, they didn't have, most of them had no fat on them whatsoever. I will caution that when a bird is migrating, when they stop at a location, the reason they're stopping and feed is because they need to feed and they need to put on fat stores. So it's not necessarily unusual that they don't have fat stores on, but all of the birds were very thin and emaciated, didn't have a lot of fat. So that might be surprising. And if a bird is in poor health, then yes, it is more vulnerable, just like a human, to acquiring a disease or contracting a disease. So yeah. So that's one thing that hopefully in the future we'll be able to pull some funding together to look at.
All right. Well, Dr. Desmond, thank you so much for joining me.
You're most welcome. Thank you.